So the house that I grew up in was on Orchard Street in Burbank, California. I don't know much of the history of the home, but what I do know is that it was one of the first houses ever built in that area. It was called Orchard Street because it was a giant orchard field leading up to that point. I don't know how long the house was around for before it got into our family, but it was in our family for, I'd say, about 50 plus years. Everybody had experiences at that house when they were growing up. I personally never had an experience, but my aunts, my grandmother, everybody that lived in that house at some point all said that they saw and heard things. You would see things when I was growing up, you would see things, walking by, or at least see shadows, or you hear noises and stuff. But I never saw like somebody physically standing there. It would just be like a shadow walking by that you could kind of just, brush off as nothing. We moved into the house in, say, about the early to mid 2000s to take care of my stepfather's mother, my grandmother, who was just getting old and just kind of on her last leg. We moved in so my mother could take care of her, and then we could kind of take care and do the upkeep of the house. Again, nothing crazy was happening, but the house was definitely infested with spirits. Like, there were spirits everywhere. The only ones that we knew for sure was there was a old style chimney sweeper with the old, black and white suit and the top hat, and a little girl about age 5 to 7 in, the old style Victorian dress with the bow in her hair and the works. And then just a bunch of what almost seemed like random spirits just popping in and out of the house. Again, you'd hear stuff, you'd see stuff, but nothing too crazy. Nobody was getting attacked, nothing was getting thrown. It was just, little bangs, little noises, footsteps, stuff like that. As my grandmother began to get closer to death, she would start talking to what appeared to be nothing. You would just hear her having full-blown conversations as if, she was speaking to somebody in the house. Now, before I get into depth with that, my auntie, who she wasn't blood related, she was just a family friend that grew up with us her whole life, but she was a psychic. Now, I am a big skeptic when it comes to psychics. I do believe that there are some people that have gifts and abilities and stuff like that, but I feel like a majority of them are just con artists. It's an easy to prey on the people that just are in a vulnerable state and just looking for something. But she predicted a lot of stuff that was just pretty bizarre. Like, it was crazy how she was able to predict certain things and tell you things that would happen before it happened. And yeah, so I mean, she was probably the most convincing I have ever seen. She told us that there were countless spirits and kind of gave us information about it. She said the chimney sweeper was doing his rounds, fell down and died. Fell through the chimney and died. And his spirit is trapped in this house. It's been trapped in this house since the day of his death. And that the little girl actually died of a sickness. She wasn't sure what sickness, but she died at a young age from sickness. And has been trapped in the house ever since. Now, we had, again, this is an old style house. So the house down to the right of it, we had the old style basement. It was your typical, scary basement. It was creepy. It had these stairs that went down, and as you got deeper down, it got colder. They weren't the wood stairs, they were concrete stairs. We had this old wood door, and it was just this excessively dark with the hanging light, that you'd pull the little lever down and it would turn on. And it also was the access to under the house. So you could actually see all the way through the house. So it just had this creepy, ambiance to it. And most people were afraid of the basement. We had family that would come over that wouldn't go anywhere near that basement. They said it was evil. They said there was, something evil in there and all that stuff. So my aunt said that there was a portal in the basement. She said it wasn't a big portal. It was just a sliver at the time. And said that spirits are basically funneling in and out. They're kind of passing through, almost like they're just kind of passing through real quick, jumping back in, disappearing. So that's why we're getting so many spirits randomly just popping in and out of the house. So back to my grandmother, who was talking to spirits. The way the house was set up was it wasn't 2 stories. It was long. So her room was in the middle and then mine was at the end next to her. So she would call me all the time to get my sister out of her closet. Now, my sister was about 5 or 6 at the time, but she was not in her closet. And I don't spook easy. I've always been sort of fearless in a lot of ways. Like, I would go down to the basement, no problem. Stay hang out in the basement, all that stuff, because no one wanted to go down there. So it was kind of like my playground because I wouldn't have to be bothered. But I would go and check on my sister in the closet. And I have to say, it is really off-putting and it is a little creepy when you have an old woman yelling at you that there is a little girl standing next to you in her closet and there is nothing there. It is a little off-putting that she's screaming to get the little girl that is smiling and smirking at her out of her closet so she can sleep, because the little girl is keeping her up while she's playing. It's a little creepy because there's nothing there. I can clearly see there's nothing there, and she is so adamant that this little girl is playing in her closet, giggling and smiling, and it has to be my sister. So she ended up passing away a couple months later. And that's when we started to see a little more. According to my aunt, the rift opened a little more because she was communicating and reaching out to these spirits. That by her communicating and kind of inviting these spirits into the home, the portal opened even more, funneling even more spirits into the house. But again, it was almost like a turnstile. So they were coming in and out, funneling through good, evil. And she said that there was just this presence just kind of hovering. So again, nothing crazy happened. We weren't, people weren't being attacked. Nobody was getting thrown. Just again, spirits walking by. You'd hear noises. You'd see stuff, like little flashes of things. The only people that swore that they saw a little girl was one of my cousins was staying with us for a while. And her and my mother at the exact same time said they saw this little girl standing in the doorway. And my sister wasn't even home. My sister was with my stepfather out. I don't really remember exactly what they were doing, but I know no one was in the home. It was just me and then my aunt and my mother. And I was watching TV and not looking in that direction. But my mother and my cousin at the time jumped up and tried to look for this little girl because they both saw her at the exact same time. And they both claim it was clear as day that she was standing there in her dress, Victorian dress, just watching. She wasn't doing anything. She was just chilling. So, again, the kind of the sightings and the noises started ramping up. Well, my grandfather on my mother's side, my mother's dad, he was living with us because my grandmother passed away when I was about age 9. So he had lived with us during that time. And he had the same exact routine. He would go to this bar at the end of the block, do his thing, have his beers and stuff like that, and then he would walk home. And every night he'd come home at about 2:30, 3 in the morning, grab a drink, grab a snack, whatever, go to bed. Well, one day, unfortunately, he was hit and killed by a drunk driver. And it killed my mother. My mother was just devastated. It just ate her up inside, and then we had this whole court battle, and it was just a nightmare. And he was kind of the thing holding her together, because it was her best friend and it was her father. He was like a father figure to me, pretty much raised me my whole life, and it was just a really tough time. And you would hear almost like he was coming home every night. Again, he had the same routine. He'd get home about 2:30 to 3 in the morning, and at that time you would hear the door open in the kitchen, because we had this door that led outside to the street from on the side, and it led into the kitchen. You would hear what sounded like that door opening, shutting, somebody walking through the house, grabbing their drink and their snack. You'd hear the cupboard and the fridge and everything. And then you would just, you would smell him. Like, I don't know if you've ever been around somebody that hangs out in a bar a lot, but they have this distinct smell. This, smell of cigarettes and whatever else it is. And, cigarettes and regret is what he used to say. So, anyway, you would smell that in the kitchen, especially at that time. Like, if you were in the kitchen at that time, it was like overwhelmingly strong, because he used to always wear the same jacket, and you would smell that smell from that jacket. Well, my mother was feeling weak one night and decided to do exactly what they tell you you're never, ever, ever supposed to do. And that was invite him and beg him and pray to him to visit her in her sleep. And he did. And the reason they tell you you're not supposed to do that is because you open a door that you can't shut and that anything can walk through. And my mother said she had a very wonderful dream with him. They spoke, they laughed. She said it was a very good closing moment for her. But then things ramped up for her. If you were standing in the center of her bedroom and you could look down through the floor, the basement is right below her room. At the edge of her, basically the foot of her bed is the center of that basement. So one night, shortly after, this was maybe a week or so after she had this dream, that presence that my aunt described, we found out what it was. My mother was sleeping, and she had, your essential sleep paralysis. She said she was wide awake. She swears she was wide awake. That she was not sleeping, she was not dreaming, nothing. That she felt like something was holding her down. She was paralyzed. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't nothing. She couldn't scream, nothing. And was doing everything she could to break free. And she said all of a sudden, she was face to face with what she described as a demon. With this black shadowy figure that you couldn't see. The only thing you could see is this elongated goat face with red eyes, is what she said. Was looking at her eye to eye, holding her down, and then begin to drag her to the foot of the bed, which is the center of the basement, like I said. My mother said as she was being dragged, she was trying to kick, scream, do whatever she could. She said she was able to pull the blinds, the plastic blinds, off the wall, punch a hole through the window, and knocked over the little stanchion on the side of her bed. And nobody heard a thing. My stepfather, that had fallen asleep on the couch maybe 15 feet away, heard nothing. Me, on which the house wrapped around, you could literally, like, our rooms were essentially next to each other. I could knock on the wall and you could hear it from her room. I heard nothing. Nobody heard a thing. But my mother pulled the curtains off the wall, punched a hole through the window, knocked over the stanchion, wrecked her room. She had cuts on her hands from her punching the window and was being dragged to the edge of the bed. She said the only thing she could think of was to pray. She prayed to God, she prayed to you name it, and she said then she prayed to my grandmother, who was a super religious woman. She was a born-again Christian, taught Sunday school, church every Sunday, everything. She said that when she prayed to my grandmother, this bright light in the corner of the room, so bright it was almost blinding, basically shined and pushed this demon back into the basement, saving my mother. My mother swears it was my grandmother. She swears, she said she didn't see it, but she said she felt it. It was her. It was her basically saving her from whatever was about to happen. It's safe to say my mother didn't go in that room for about a month or so until we fully cleansed the house. And even then, it just, you always felt this like presence. And the spirits never fully went away. Eventually, we ended up losing the house. I ended up moving out on my own. My family ended up moving elsewhere. And up until my mother passed away not too long ago, a little over a year ago, she swore her story never changed. She swore up and down that what she saw was real and it was not a dream and that she was wide awake. So I leave this to you as hopefully a lesson to never, ever, ever invite a loved one to visit you in your sleep, because you never know what's going to come through that door. Take it from my mother, who is lucky to be alive, who's lucky to, I don't know, have her soul, because the next person might not be so lucky.